We should mention perhaps the biggest news of the Easter break before we start. One of the major events in the arts of the last few weeks that will have had, I think, a monumental impact on a lot of people in the industry, not least us in the Classical Top 5 podcast. It took a lot of work behind the scenes, and I know it was pretty horrendous for those directly involved, but having made it happen, I think we're all going to be thankful for it. Richard Bratby has finally had his hair cut, so you can rest easy, everyone. This is the Classical Top 5. I'm Tommy Pearson, and with me is the newly coiffured Richard Bratby and Charlotte Gardner, who's fresh from a holiday out west. Lovely to be back. I hope you've enjoyed the interviews that we've been posting over the break. There'll be more of those later in the year. How was your Easter then, Richard and Charlotte? And what music's been in your ears since we last met? Charlotte, I mentioned you've been out west.
Yeah, and do you know, I did something really, really rare for me, and I didn't put any music in my ears. The music I had was the sound of the sea and the seagulls, and it was really, really nice. Now, of course, I've been listening to a lot of music since I got back, but it's funny, when I go on holiday, normally I relax by listening to music in the evening, but there was something about this time, I just didn't fancy it somehow.
Good for you. What about you, Richard?
I've been writing about Mozart as an arm's length, and that means I've been listening to Mozart as an arm's length, which is always a good thing. It generally, I used to talk about the Mozart effect. It's supposed to make you clever. I don't know if it makes you clever. I think it does put you in a better mood, however. I'm writing program notes for the Salzburg Festival, and some this week for a concert hall in Berlin, the Haydn. The quartet's dedicated to Haydn. I've been listening to a lot. I've been listening to some of his symphonies from the Salzburg period, which are just such youthful energy, freshness. It's just the sort of thing when the skies are blue and the breeze is fresh outside, and you're kind of raring to get on with doing things again after so long. So I can't really grumble. Occasionally work delivers these little coincidences. It's very nice to be doing that.
Very nice. Yeah, the weather has been very nice. I've been watching some movies, which doesn't sound particularly unusual, but for me, in the last 18 months or so, very unusual to actually watch a film from beginning to end without any interruption from screaming babies. And it's been great. And so I've been catching up on some films in the afternoon. It's been nice. And actually, a bit like Charlotte, sort of not really been listening to that much music, although I did get completely obsessed with an old Genesis track, for which I've been receiving unbelievable abuse on social media ever since. I love Genesis, and I don't care who knows it, but a lot of people feel very passionately towards them, and they've been telling me all about it. Anyway, our subject this week, we should move on to, is unjustly neglected works, those pieces that we think should get a more regular hearing in concert halls, but for whatever reason have been ignored. Now, perhaps they were hurt by a substandard premiere, or just played once and forgotten. Maybe they were ahead of their time, but their time never came, or perhaps they simply fell out of fashion. How have you got on with this one, guys? Charlotte? It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you have to try and think about what do we actually mean by neglected? Because it's different to being ignored, isn't it?
It is. And there wasn't just that, but the fact that with this podcast, what we've been doing over this series, I think a lot of us have tried to bring in our favourite neglected works as we've gone along the way. So when suddenly we had to come up with the neglected works, it was well, my gosh, what haven't I already mentioned, or what has somebody else not already mentioned?
Yes.
So this it should have been a gift, but actually it was a really, really hard one to put together. I'm quite pleased with what I've come up with. I'm very pleased, actually, but it was interesting quite how difficult it was when I'd already blown my Nielsen violin concerto boat and the Beethoven choral fantasy and all of these pieces that normally I'd be up on my bandbox about instantly.
Oh, well, I admire your effort, Charlotte, because I've actually ignored that completely and brought in some ones that I've already been banging on about. Because
you cheat!
Because even after banging on about them, unbelievable as it may seem, they're still being ignored. So what can I say? Richard, how about you?
Well, for me, it's not a question of what does neglected mean, it's what does unfairly neglected mean.
Yes.
I mean, this is a topic that tends to anger people. I've found everyone has their own favourite pieces, everyone has their own favourite neglected pieces. But there's a lot of music in existence, isn't there? As you and I know, I think in total about 0.5% of it gets played regularly.
Quite.
Maybe all the music ever written. I just said I was looking at Mozart and Salzburg last week, and I was reading a reference book. It said that if you put together all the various composers, some minor figures working in Salzburg in the second half of the 18th century, something like 70 or 80 symphonies written in Salzburg alone are known to exist. Now, of those, we hear I think 2 of them ever, and they're by one composer. And that's just one small German city in 20 years in the late 18th century. I mean, just think how much music was written in that period, say between 1750 and 1800. How much of that music exists in total? Stupendous quantities of stuff. And out of that, we hear perhaps 3 composers ever. Out of literally thousands who existed and who worked and were prolific and were enjoyed in their time. Now, is that fair? Is that unfair? It's certainly a fact of life. I think if you start saying that only 5% of music played is from X category, you say, well, you're saying that's only 5% of the 0.005% of all music that is ever played. You're talking about, so it's perhaps less shocking. Also, I have this feeling that some pieces. There are pieces that just bear listening to over and over again, and people clearly respond to, that get richer and deeper, more enjoyable every time you hear them. There are pieces that you do perhaps want to hear once in a while, that are strong, that have perhaps a good idea or a couple of good ideas, have something about them that's worth hearing. But really, perhaps hearing it live once or twice, then having a good recording to put it on when you want to, that's kind of... I don't think that's necessarily an unfair judgment of posterity, if that's all that ever happens with that piece. It's not always an outrageous injustice.
One of my favourite phrases is neglected masterpiece. So often you come across a piece that someone's discovered and it's immediately a masterpiece, almost because no one's really heard it before. It must be a masterpiece. But of course, if it is a masterpiece, generally speaking, it's heard by people, and there's often a reason why a piece is neglected, isn't there? And it might be because it's not a masterpiece and it isn't actually worth listening to more than a couple of times, perhaps.
That's it. I think it all happens against the background of the fact that the ecology of the musical world throughout human history is epically unfair. The judgment of posterity is unfair, or perhaps it is brutally fair. Maybe that's what we're dealing with. Yes. I mean, I've gone for pieces that I genuinely think do deserve to be heard more. That people, I think, have a lot to offer, that are much better than their level of popularity and currency suggests. And there's all sorts of cultural reasons, historic reasons, practical reasons why we don't hear these pieces. But I think someone should be going out there making them happen, making them heard, and that if people hear them, they'll wonder why we don't hear them more.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely got some choices that actually I really genuinely can't understand why they're not performed more often. I mean, I can't think of a political reason. I can't think of taste reasons. I can't think of any reason really why they're not chosen. But that is often just the way it goes. And actually, I mentioned fashion in my introduction. I mean, that's in Charlotte. Fashion is incredibly important in this regard, isn't it? Some pieces simply go in and out of fashion.
Yeah, they do. And it's not just pieces that go in and out of fashion. It's performance styles that go in and out of fashion. I mean, Handel was not the only person who was a wizard improvising on the organ in his day. There were some really big stars, and none of them have lasted into posterity except him. Same if you look at the 19th century piano world in Paris. It was not just Liszt and, to begin with, Chopin who were on stage then. There are massively famous figures, possibly more popular than they were, but they just haven't lasted the distance, perhaps because the music wasn't quite right. So it is interesting. There are also performance styles that just hit the mood of the day and just don't work now.
Yeah,
or don't work on disc.
So come on then, Charlotte. What's one of your first?
Well, the first one, I guess, in terms of where my usual lines of discussion are, it's an unusual one for me. It's Elizabeth McConkey's one-act opera, The Sofa. Now, you talk about things that are just quite difficult to stage, and I think one-act operas are one of those. But I was thinking about this last night, and the opera world, I think, has a really, really small repertoire of one-act operas that hit the stage all the time. And there's a massive number that just never see the light of day. Now, Elizabeth McConkey was somebody I never even saw as an opera composer. I knew her for her string quartets as a teenager and beyond. And then in 2009, Chandos brought out this CD of two one-act operas, The Sofa and The Departure, It was independent opera at Sadler's Wells with Dominic Wheeler conducting. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Both works, absolutely wonderful. The departure, emotionally more harrowing, and it's wonderful. There's only so many times I could listen to it. It's about a woman who's sitting at her dressing table and she hears funeral music and she sees her mother shaking hands with her friends. And eventually it dawns on her that it's her funeral. She got hit by a car, and it's harrowing. But The Sofa was the one I just absolutely got blown away with. It was completed in 1957, premiered in 1959 at Sadler's Wells, libretto by Ursula Vaughan-Williams, and it was based on Le Sofa by the 18th century satirist Crébillon Fils. And it's just a masterpiece in gem size. The plot line is just absolutely delicious. 19th century, Dominic is holding a ball, and in the anteroom away from everybody else, he's trying to seduce Monique on the sofa. Now, Dominic has this very overbearing grandmother who he will inherit all of his wealth from, and she disapproves of him, and she walks in on them just at the crucial moment, absolutely scandalized. And so to teach him a lesson, because she also has magical powers, she decides to turn him into a sofa. And the only way the spell can be broken is if a couple make love on top of him. So various couples do arrive, wondering where poor old Dominic is, and they don't quite consummate. And then finally, it's Dominic's rival with Monique who finally do. So then, of course, Sofa pings out. There's Dominic back with Monique, and it's all terribly awkward. But it's so fresh and fun and individual. I had seen McConkie as this quite severe, dissonant tonality person. I'm very lyrical, but I have to admit, as much as I admire her quartets, I don't put them on for fun. And then this, whereas it's melodic, it's modern opera buffa. There's hints of Janacek in the vocal writing, but there's patter song, clever laughter patter song. There's Broadway cabaret swing, Strauss, Puccini, pastiche, very British wit with it. The ensemble's really clever. It's scored for single woodwinds, two horns, trumpet, percussion, piano, harp, and single strings. It's really, really effective, constantly changing textures. Sometimes it really does fill the sound, and other times it really comes down to almost nothing. And it's funny, English 20th century is so dominated by Benjamin Britten, and yet here is this absolute glorious party of a piece that just has so much to offer. And it's not, of course, it's not just Elizabeth McConkie. I think that Vaughan-Williams's Riders to the Sea, another one-act opera, is I think it deserves more airtime than it gets. I don't know whether Richard's chuckling because he disagrees with me or whether he agrees with me.
But can I just say, one of the disadvantages, surely, of one-act operas is that it is difficult to place them. If you're not doing a concert performance of something, and of course now a lot of people do concert performances of one-act operas, but if you're doing it as an opera, it's difficult for an opera house to know quite what to do with them unless you do a little sort of set of one-act operas, which doesn't really feel quite right. You want to have a narrative through the evening, and one-act opera is not going to do that for you enough. And it's an incredibly expensive thing to do. So actually to do something so short, maybe that's one of the reasons why they're not always done, because there's so many of them.
Well, I think there are two things there. I mean, the first thing is that I think post-COVID, people are going to be a lot more open to not just the standard way things were done before. I think everybody is actually open to a shorter evening. I think that maybe opera houses, ballet companies they were nervous of putting that on before because people wouldn't think they were getting value for money. But I think actually there's an awful lot of merit in just saying, we're going to put a one-act opera on for you. You can buy a ticket for that. You can buy a ticket for something after the interval as well, or you can just take that. And then also what I think I've worked, something that I have seen work quite well with one-act operas in the past is when you don't even pair them with a one-act opera, you prepare them perhaps with a ballet or a symphonic work or something in the afternoon, and in the second half. And also with something like this, I mean, with the sofa, I mean, it's so tiny. This could be a semi-staged thing. You could actually put it on a concert hall stage, have the sofa, have people coming in and out, and then just do a symphony in the second half.
Well, that's what I mean. I mean, that's far more likely than putting it in an opera house with all of the economics that go with that. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out why it is that things like this don't get done very often. I mean, am I on the right track, Richard?
Well, I mean, opera.
Oh,
North.
hang on. Simon's somewhere in the background.
Oh, crap. Okay.
Eliminate the hair.
Eliminate the hair.
So, Richard, am I on the right track? Simon, shush. Like I can only just hear you, by the way, only just. So it's sort of there in the back of my head. Okay, Richard, am I on the right track?
I think there's definitely a point in that. I mean, Opera North has been trying this. It's tried it a couple of times now with a couple of series. A few years ago, we did something called Eight Little Greats. And more recently, they brought back, I think it was 6 in a more recent season. I see they're reviving some of them in the first season. They just announced yesterday, I think, of their first sort of post-COVID season. They're going to be bringing out a few of these one-actors. Quite often what they did with those was they reused sets, they recycled sets. They sort of use things quite inventively. I get the impression, having spoken to them, the problem with all that is marketing. It's just explaining to people you're getting a double bill. It's not that people don't love the things, that the pieces aren't great and they work brilliantly, and it's a fascinating original way of presenting opera. It's just you've somehow got to explain to the audience what they're getting, and it's much harder to do that when you've got sort of 2, 3 completely separate things. We don't go to cinema double bills anymore, do we? There's no such thing as a B movie nowadays. We're not used to that. We've lost that idea. And also, I know Opera North used to do a kind of mix and match thing. You sort of like a sort of fruit machine. You'd never get the same operas in the same combination twice. You might show up one night and get Janacek's Ossud with Gilbert and Sullivan's Trial by Jury, or you might show up and get Bernstein's Trouble in Tahiti with Il Segreto di Susanna, something like that. And you know, how do you choose which to go to? What do you want to see them all? You're a completist. So I get the impression that's been their main problem with that. But it's, as Charlotte says, I think it's an idea that its moment has come. Buxton, I know, are putting on Malcolm Arnold's one-act opera, The Dancing Master, this summer. I went to Glyndebourne, lowered themselves to do Offenbach last autumn. They did Offenbach's. Offenbach wrote about 50 little one-actors. That's originally what he called operettas. When they're more than one act, he didn't call them operettas. He called them opera bouffe, various other things. But he did Madame de l'État. It was brilliant. 1 hour, socially distanced, perfect, just what you need. And it hit the spot. So yeah, maybe it's an idea. Its time has come. I mean, I had 2 on my list, and Charlotte has just blown one of those.
No.
Well, I was going to talk about Riders to the Sea. When you mentioned British opera, I was going to talk about volumes of Riders to the Sea, which I have seen done in a triple bill once. And God, what a piece! 30-minute torrent of emotion. It's a sort of anatomy of grief. It's a play by Synge, the Irish playwright of the 1920s, set on the west coast of Ireland, a fishing community, a group of women who have just lost their menfolk and just know that they're going to lose more menfolk before the night is out, and they're just waiting for the blow to hit, and that's it. It's just waiting for that disaster to happen, and it's a sort of everything you think about Vaughan Williams, forget about it, throw it away. It's raw, it's passionate, turbulent music, just from the sea sweeping through it. You know, it gives Benjamin Britten a real run for his money. Long before, of course, this is long before any of Britten's operas. I'm sure he must have known it, must have heard it, because it uses the language, the drama so economically, and the music is so immersed in that sort of windswept, salty, chilly, but raw and passionate world. And it's only about 30 minutes. It's an unforgettable 30 minutes. But sort of Charlotte has already mentioned that. I may as well throw in another one-act opera, which is the other one I had lined up, which is a comic opera by Korngold. Korngold aficionados will tell you he is unfairly neglected as a whole. I would not disagree. I do think he's made a lot of headway recently. You can get good recordings. Certainly, if you go to Europe, you can get good performances of most of his major operas these days. The one that no one really talks about or does or knows is a little comedy that he wrote called The Ring of Polycrates, which he wrote when he was a teenager in a double bill with the tragic opera Violante, which has been done in the UK. The Ring of Polycrates is a little comedy set in the 18th century, and it's written in that kind of delicious Edwardian mock classical style, witty, playful, colourful, scored for a sort of smallish orchestra by Korngold standards. Incredibly lively, incredibly funny. It quotes Haydn. It's got a lot of tenderness, warmth, romanticism. It fits into just under an hour. All those qualities you want in a comic opera. In a composer who really, really knew how to apply the colour, of how to pace things, how to make things witty, how to make things fun, how to make things light, and also that sort of edge of warm, rich, kind of iridescent Viennese romanticism sort of laying over the whole thing. And I keep asking people to do it. I keep saying you should do that. It would go brilliantly. Do it with Bluebeard's Castle, whatever it takes. Hasn't got there yet, but if all. Korngold is unfairly neglected. Of his works, I think this one is more neglected than most, and less justifiably, I think, than some.
You bring up a very important point, which is the people that one needs to persuade to perform these pieces. It's not often the performers themselves actually that need persuading. It's the administrators, isn't it, that are in charge of things like orchestras, chamber orchestras, concert halls, and of course broadcasters, all of whom have real power when it comes to the tastes of the nation, if you like, don't they? These are the people that, I mean, Korngold, I think, is an interesting one, very alongside one of my choices, which I'll bring up a little bit later, because he's best known for his film music, and therefore a lot of people will simply dismiss him anyway without bothering to listen to any of his music, because they won't take him seriously, even though everybody knows that Korngold was a, inverted commas, serious composer before he was a film composer. It drives me crazy that a lot of people have that opinion before they've even started, so they won't actually put them in the mix because of that. That's kind of what we're up against with some of these, with a lot of these pieces, isn't it? We're having to deal with administrators, all of whom are human and have their own tastes and their own directions they want to go in.
Completely. And I think also they often get it wrong as to what people want anyway. It's funny, just to go back to the earlier point about mourning about how audiences don't necessarily want a short opera because they don't know what to do with it and they are expecting a big long story. It's funny that we're even having that discussion in a world where essentially the problem that most people are talking about with arts is that people have the attention span of a gnat these days. So surely single act operas are perfect for society, because if everybody has the attention span of a gnat, then they can make it for a single act opera. But somehow that hasn't computed with the marketing guys either.
But I don't think that's what it is. I mean, I think you're right. I think you're right, but ultimately it comes down to money. If it's too much money to put on, and particularly, by the way, right now, I mean, I think you're right, absolutely, that right now there's going to be a need and a taste for these things. But it's a question of whether the people who put it on can actually afford to do it, not really whether the audience will like it. They'll probably think the audience will love it, but can we afford to do it?
Or can we afford to take a risk and not just put on Beethoven 5, which people will come
exactly
to?
Right. I mean, I have a feeling that only the rich ensembles are going to be able to do anything adventurous for a while, and then things, I'm sure, will start to get back. One of the things I want to do is I want to look back on my concert going life and try and remember those pieces that really excited me at that moment, and then I never heard them again. Or at least I got the recording, but I never heard them live again. And actually one of them, and I genuinely don't understand why this piece isn't done more often, because it's such fun. It's quite jazzy. It's fizzy. It's full of life. It's got a really lovely also slow movement and brilliant. It's Hindemith, and I really honestly didn't think I'd come to Hindemith like this, but it's my favorite piece of Hindemith, and it's Kammer Music No. 1. He wrote a number of chamber music pieces, but Kammer Music No. 1, I heard it in a prom that I think I've probably mentioned before on the podcast, in the mid-80s, early mid-80s. The London Sinfonietta and the BBC Symphony Orchestra did it. It was a 3-part modern music prom, and it included, by the way, another piece I'm going to pick by at that point a living composer. But the Sinfonietta started, I think they started the whole concert with Kammer Music No. 1. And I never heard it before. I didn't really know anything about Hindemith at this point. I was probably about 12, 13. But I highly recommend people go and hear it, because it's not, I think a lot of people think Hindemith, I don't know what it is about Hindemith. A lot of people can't quite get into him. They don't quite find a way into him. I think sometimes they feel it's a bit dour. And there isn't a huge amount of his music played, even though he wrote an enormous amount of music. But there's only really a few handpicked pieces now, aren't there, that ever really get done. Kammer Music No. 1 is obviously chamber music, and it's got some great fun sounds to it. It's got a car, it's got a siren at the end, like a nuclear war siren at the end. It's great fun. It's got all sorts of wonderful colours in it, and as I say, it's fun sounding, but it's also I don't know, it feels exciting and it's fresh. And even now, after all these years of it being written, it just has that, it grabs you immediately, and it's very, very accessible piece. And I just don't understand why people don't play it more often. I mean, the other problem, of course, though, thinking about this, is that I think although we all live in this sort of world, it's a big world out there, And I'm perfectly willing to accept that someone will come along and say, oh, by the way, Hindemith's Camera Music #1 is played about 50 times a year in Albania or something. And I have absolutely no idea. And of course, publishers never really let you know about this stuff on their websites, or a lot of them don't. So maybe it is performed lots, but I haven't heard it live here for a long, or seen it programmed in the UK for a very, very long time. And I would very much like to hear it done again, because it's a great piece. Do either of you know that?
I used to get a regular magazine. We got posted to me at work called Hindemith Journal, which was paid for by the Hindemith estate. And I think they bribed I think it maybe shops of publishers to just post it with their catalogue.
Right.
And lots of advocating for Hindemith going on there. And I don't know, my main thought was, we programmed one of his camera music in Birmingham with the youth orchestra, the brass one. Greatly enjoyed, always enjoyed by players. I think there you've got this problem of a weird, wacky combination of instruments, a non-standard combination that someone has to really sit down, get together, direct, assemble, pay for the extras. Also, old Hindemith didn't help himself with his names. He's his own worst PR. His sort of determination not to sort of dumb down what he was doing. You end up with a jolly, tuneful, crowd-pleasing piece with a title like Symphonic Metamorph. What was it called? What's it called? Symphonic Metamorphoses upon themes of Carl Real Weber. Yeah. It's useless. What do you say about that? You can't even
great piece.
Can't even say it. Yeah, that's it. It's a stonking piece, isn't it? It's a crowd pleaser. It's him. He decides he's going to please the American mass audience by writing an accessible, tuneful, colourful little mini concerto for orchestra, practically, and then he calls it, Symphonic Metamorphoses upon themes of Carl Real. What? It sounds like a mathematical formula. It sounds like a cough medicine, so he didn't always help himself, I don't think. But yeah, he's hugely underrated, I think. There's so much wit, so much colour, again, so much liveliness and imagination in that music. Again, people love it when they hear it, and then they're surprised when they find out who wrote it.
I mentioned about having to convince administrators to perform a lot of composers. I mean, not just single pieces, but whole composers' outputs. I remember at Radio 3, this was something, of course, that was levelled at the controller every day of the week. Why are you ignoring this composer? Why are you ignoring that composer? I mean, it was Havergal Brian, but there were other ones as well that people felt that we were absolutely ignoring on purpose. And it comes back, I suppose, to what Richard was saying at the beginning, that 99% of music isn't performed at all, out of all of the music that's written. But I know with William Glock, for example, this sort of towering figure in British musical life as controller of Radio 3 and head of the Proms, 60s, early 70s, and that sort of Boulez time. That was when a lot of these English composers, symphonists, and not just English, many of them homegrown in the United Kingdom, were essentially ignored because they weren't writing in the style that was felt to be appropriate at that time. And that's the danger, isn't it, Richard? I mean, like whole swathes of composers, many of whom have societies and magazines attached to them these days, were essentially ignored by the biggest broadcaster and supporter of classical music in the country.
The old BBC blacklist story. It's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, William Glock. I've had the pleasure, as we all have, of working with people who've been at the BBC and working with the BBC, and it's interesting. You do notice, I can well believe there was never a formal decree went out that these people were not to be played. But
definitely not.
There's a kind of shared understanding which sort of permeates it. I worked with a colleague who's ex BBC, and it was very noticeable that every year one of their staff conductors would put forward a piece by Malcolm Arnold. He would always want it on the programme. So he'd say, yeah, we'll think about that. Certainly take it on board. No, not averse to doing Arnold. And always, every year, by the time it got to the brochure being in print, Arnold would have vanished.
Yeah.
I've just read a book about to come out quite soon by another highly placed former BBC Radio 3 person. It's a history of music, by someone formerly very senior at the BBC and very senior at the Proms. And history of music in about 250 pages is a hell of an ask, really. Who are you going to include? Who are you going to not include? Well, put it this way. I mean, well, Malcolm Arnold isn't in there. Robert Simpson isn't in there. He does find time for Alexander Gurr. He does find time for Colin Matthews. And this kind of thing, this, in the global perspective of 2,000 years of Western music, if Colin Matthews is big enough to appear, I'm a little surprised by some of the people who didn't, and it just makes you wonder.
And actually, I mean, British composers always come off worse on this. I wonder what your theory is about this, Charlotte. I mean, I as always, put out word about this podcast on my Facebook page to see what people's own neglected pieces were, and I would say a large majority of them are by what they consider to be ignored or neglected British symphonic composers from somewhere in the middle of the 20th century. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. I think that Britain, possibly more than any other country, has always had a problem celebrating its own. We're not quite cool enough. It's trendier, it's more intelligent to look to the continent. I don't really know where that comes from, whether it comes from sort of the Germanic symphonic tradition and our obsession, quite rightly, with the perfumed French culture. And in fact, I've got a French work on my own list. But I think it has to be something like that. And I wonder whether there is a feeling that we can't celebrate our own for fear that we don't look knowledgeable enough. And it's something that I really struggled with. For university, my final year dissertation was on Elizabeth Lutyens, who had many works performed at the proms and by the BBC in her time, who's been pretty much dropped by everybody since. And there's a whole series. Elizabeth McConkie, again, she was a major, particularly a chamber composer. I mean, her string quartets are wonderful. And you say Arnold Bax, Malcolm Arnold. There are so many composers. Constant Lambert, all of these figures who were major in the time, and we do kind of forget about them. And the funny thing is that we do then sort of squirrel away into these continental archives and go, oh, there was this amazing Italian who was writing in this particular tiny province in 1870, and this is the person we should be talking about as a masterpiece. And yet we're forgetting about all of these wonderful names back home.
Yeah, I mean, Robert Simpson and George Lloyd, I think, are the two big obvious ones that seem to be blatantly ignored. I mean, it does seem odd that they are literally not even mentioned ever by certain people, and yet they are of a certain taste, and I quite like some Simpson, but not all of it. But that's okay, because I quite like some composers and not all of their output. That's okay too. But it does seem extraordinary how with fashion it just comes in and out, and with those two particularly who had big symphonic output, particularly symphonies anyway, that they're not anywhere near the regular repertoire.
I do wonder whether there is partly an issue about a fear of picking somebody that's a national talent rather than an international talent, and the safety with going abroad is that if you've noticed them from our island, then they must be good. Whereas if you're picking up a national person, who knows, maybe they're not good enough and that you're going to look silly for having championed them.
Richard?
There's definitely, I call it some cultural cringe at work in Britain. There always has been for many centuries of British music, some cultural cringe towards the continent. I mean, it's I've been in many discussions where it's sort of, you parochial British with your Vaughan Williams. I hope, but in Germany, no one even plays him. But then that's supposed to be a sign that British audiences are unsophisticated. But then it's kind of, what do you mean you don't play more Wolfgang Riem, you Philistines? Why aren't you more into, Werner Eck? How parochial. So essentially, if the idea of a minor European composer is somehow automatically more sophisticated than a major British composer is one that's quite hard to get past. Equally, I mean, again, I don't want to be too jingoistic about this. We're all in Britain, we're all British, and this is why we know people who are aware of this music and are enthusiastic and have formed societies promoting it. I mean, when we had our edition on American symphonies, I mean, and we all, I think, came away with a repertoire that, again, I imagine people feel very strongly about there. And there are probably similar people lobbying for the music of David Diamond, of Howard Hanson, of Roy Harris, of whom we don't really even enter our consciousness, even those of us who consider ourselves quite musically aware. And it is, I mean, it can be a bit of a local thing, I'm sure of that.
Well, Richard, while you're on that, Christopher Russell, who was our guest on the American Symphonies one, he's put on my Facebook page a number of ones and mentioned composers I've never even heard of, as he always does. But he says composers he feels are ignored. Like, in fact, they were mentioned in that program: Walter Piston, Schumann, Diamond, Menin. He also mentions Glazunov symphonies, which I know you'd be up for, that aren't performed enough. Symphonies by Alan Peterson. I don't know Alan Peterson at all. Dvorak 6, he's put in. He said not exactly neglected, but should be up there. And Langard symphonies as well. He says up to number 7 because the rest of the other 16 are laughably bad. Except for the completely insane 6-minute 11th symphony featuring 4 tubas. I mean, anything that features 4 tubas has got to be worth listening to, hasn't it? But again, a collection of names there, many of whom will be very unfamiliar to I'm sure to most of us. And you suddenly realise, as we've said before, most music is ignored. Other ones just to mention before Charlotte gets to her perfumed French example. The Howells is another one. Howells piano concertos 1 and 2. David Millen just said. Michael Seal, who's another former guest on the show, conductor. York Bowen, Symphony No. 2. Keith Roberts says is a composer. Schrecker, Prelude to a Drama. Schmidt, 4th Symphony, and he mentions Hindemith's Symphonic Metamorphosis. Helen Garrison says the John Island piano concerto. And indeed mentions also Malcolm Arnold, Stanford, and George Lloyd. I quite like Phil Wright's suggestion of the rest of Also Sprach Zarathustra, because we only ever hear the beginning of it because of its movie connotations. Everybody plays the sunrise, he says, and ignores the next half an hour of glorious tone poem. I think we can all agree with that. Matthew Trigg says Lennox Berkeley's string trio. There's another one, Lennox Berkeley, who sort of sits unfairly in a way in the shadow of Britain for a number of reasons, and has written some great pieces. So there's a lot of great names in there. Right, Charlotte, your fragrant, perfumed French composer.
Okay, who is Chanson?
Oh, yes.
And the Concert in D major for violin, piano, and string quartet. Now, I suspect that in a few years' time, I'll no longer be able to talk about this one being neglected. I think slowly people are cottoning on to it, and there are a couple of really nice recordings of it already, but right now it is rarely heard and it's absolutely fabulous. It was written in 1892, concerto by name, piano sextet in instrumentation, and the solo violinist and piano and string quartet, they used in any of a number of figurations over the course of the 4 movements, and really it's all up for grabs. I mean, sometimes you've got a full-on orchestral concerto and you can play it that way. I've heard it played really, really big. And sometimes then you've got gossamer-weighted chamber textures. Sometimes it comes right down to piano sonata. The first movement, I mean, is frankly bonkers. It's this rapturously full-blooded, triumphant, voluptuous, shimmering romance with stern darkness in there as well. It's forwards pulsing, but later time sort of languorously stands still. You have to be really, really careful with this movement not to make the textures go too soupy, and as an overall listen, make it too heavy-handed, because you can take it too far and it can be exhausting. But when all the balances are struck, it's just an absolute joy. The melody, the textures, constantly changing harmonic language, new surprises at every turn. Very French. Debussy completed his string quartet the following year, and I do wonder whether he knew the chanson, because it does sound as though they're wearing the same perfume at points. And the second movement is the Sicilienne. I think it must be one of the most lovely pieces of chamber music I know. It's lilting, wistful. I've heard it played with airy hesitancy. This is the advantage of spending a lot of time in France and Switzerland, where it's heard a little bit more. And I've heard it played with airy hesitancy, which I've loved, but I've also heard musicians really lean into the sort of 19th century romance and give long, gently rapturous lines and really lean in and enjoy the swells, and it's gorgeous. And then you have this third movement, Grave, that's eerily sombre and the most programmatic of all the movements, really menacing. And then more pleasures for the final. And it's so individual, new beauties at every turn. And I think that really fascinates me about it is that it's a really difficult one for, I think, musicians, particularly who aren't French, to get a handle on. And I've heard musicians take it from rehearsal to a first performance to a second performance, and gradually each time things click into place slightly more from a beginning where it's actually a bit dissatisfying to listen to. There's definitely a language, French codes, if you like. I suppose a little bit like playing Rameau and Lully. There's so much that's in there that's not in the score, and I wonder whether the same thing it's for this as well. But when it's played well, it's magical.
Chausson, okay. Richard, when you were programming, or you were running the CBSO Youth Orchestra, were you able to slip in a couple of your little passions for pieces that you thought perhaps audiences should hear more often, given that you had the power?
Again, it's never as much power as you think. You always assume having an orchestra is being charged with the world's greatest train set, and I think anyone who's actually done it knows that that's not the case. You're tied. Your hands are tied on all sides. I suggested doing some Stokowski's arrangements of Wagner extracts, big bleeding orchestral chunks of Wagner operas, just because I thought playing 10 minutes of any Wagner is not enough. This 30, 40 minute slab of Tristan and Isolde that Stokowski had arranged without voices, sort of orchestral rhapsody. And yeah, but it was great doing it. I think they loved doing it. We had 6 offstage horns up in the big echo chambers in Symphony Hall. We did this great slice of the love music from Act 2 of Tristan, and it begins with the prelude, ends with the Liebestod, all the good bits. Getting hold of it was an absolute flaming nightmare. I mean, the fees that were charged by the copyright people, obviously Wagner's out of copyright, but Stokey isn't, and his estate wants every penny from his stuff. Once they've taken that money, they don't want to give you a set of parts that's workable. They send you these tatty bits of photocopied paper. I think they sent us a bassoon part for a completely different piece. All this had to be sorted out. There weren't the offstage parts. We had to produce them ourselves. Not all of these sort of resurrection jobs are as easy as you might think. It's not always just a case of the administrators letting the side down. It's some publishers are not always as supportive as they might be.
Actually, I can think of some examples of. Playing in the Kensington Symphony Orchestra, we often specialise in doing bits of the repertoire that no one else will really touch, and sometimes you very quickly realise why. Because the parts, and I have to say, by the way, this is certainly the case with a Korngold piece we did. The parts were they were atrocious. They were unreadable. They were all over the place, and yet they were charged full price for them. Terrible way of doing things. And of course the publishers there to try and encourage people to play this music more often. And if you get a set of parts in front of you that you can barely read, and especially these days with the ability to put this stuff into a computer really easily and quickly, absolutely no excuse for it. And that is another reason perhaps why some people get pretty upset about having to deal with these things, and they don't do them again, in other words. But anyway, Richard, give us some more of your choices.
One piece I always wanted and always tried to persuade people to play, would have loved to have programmed if I'd found anyone who wanted to do it. And the problem was I couldn't find any conductors who knew it or enthusiastic enough. I might have been able to go into bat for it. The other problem is it's a second half piece. It's as long as a symphony. It's not called a symphony. And again, people don't like to see that in programs. It's hard to persuade them to devote the entire second half of the concert to something they haven't heard. And that excludes huge amounts of repertoire, particularly symphonic repertoire, from getting a fair crack. It's harder. It's easier to program a 10-minute rarity than a 40-minute rarity. And this particular 40-minute rarity is the Suite in F sharp for orchestra by Ernest von Dohnányi, a Hungarian composer. I have a vague feeling I've mentioned on this podcast before. I love it. I love Dohnányi anyway as a composer. I think he's one of these characters, a bit like Glazunov, who writes his best music when he's actually trying slightly less hard. I think there's at least certainly 2 symphonies, possibly 3 in circulation by Dohnányi, none of which really come off. He's trying too hard to be the whole big late romantic Germanic symphonist. It's a Hungarian composer. When he writes these suites of orchestral miniatures, titles like Rurelia Hungarica, Symphonic Minutes, which are delicious, absolutely exquisite. Gorgeous chamber music as well. But this piece, a Suite in F sharp for orchestra, is just what it says. It's a suite on a symphonic scale for orchestra, 4 movements. None of them really in what you call sonata form, but all of them just deliciously scored. effortlessly melodious. There's a Hungarian flavour, but not the kind of overpowering Hungarian flavour, the excess of paprika you occasionally get with people like Kodai. And he tones it down. There's also that Viennese, that sort of element of Viennese sort of sensuality, playfulness, slight sauciness, if you like, to it as well, cheekiness. It all comes together in this beautifully scored piece. Begins with sort of theme and variations of woodwind chorales, this kind of fiery scherzo, lovely slow movements, and this finale, which is just a terrific, witty, Haydnish sort of rondo in a late romantic style. I mean, Dohnányi was brilliant at finales. I think one of the best writers of sort of witty finales since Haydn, and this just absolutely whirs along. Glowing orchestration, a real sense of sweep and bustle and enjoyment if you're going somewhere. Calls back the end of the piece at the end. There's a lovely sort of sunset and then a very, very witty, playful, bring the house down ending. And I just think any conductor with a bit of imagination, wit, and flair could really make a sensation with that piece. If one of the movements was plucked out and used on TV or advert, people would be asking what that tune was, what that beautiful music was, and no one does it. The name is not well known. There is this thing called funny name syndrome, isn't there? Eastern European name syndrome, which in classical music, if you find these fantastic composers from anywhere pretty much east of Austria, people immediately assume they're scary and difficult because they can't pronounce the name. Luzoslavsky, Enescu, Graciela Batowicz, even Janacek, even these people see the diacritics in print and they just back off, and Dohnányi, people don't know how to pronounce it, and I think that's half the battle, really.
I think you're probably right, although interesting enough, now I think of it, we used to play quite a lot of Dohnányi when I was on Radio 3. It's one of those composers that's quite nice to slip in without saying what it is, because people don't quite know what it is. I think it's one of those composers you listen to it and you think, oh, this sounds sort of slightly familiar and charming, but they don't quite put their finger on who it is.
It's from that world of Richard Strauss and Mahler and Bartók, but it's sort of leaner, it's more polished, it's kind of sunnier, more elegant, if you like. It's a slightly less all heart on sleeve, less all hang out splurge. It's slightly more classical almost, and at his best, I really think he's up there. I really enormous pleasure from his music.
I want to bring in some more of the choices that were on Facebook. Our very own Simon Funnell, our producer, mentioned Cecil Armstrong Gibbs is Odysseus. I love the name Cecil Armstrong Gibbs. Chris Fox, who's a composer, mentions Schoenberg's violin concerto. Isn't done that often. Holst is another composer that pops up. Savitri, and indeed James Webb mentions most operas under 40 minutes are good, he said. Sarah G says anything by Catelby, which I know I had a thumbs up surely from yes. I think she is. Finzi's cello concerto mentioned by Chris Loughran, and Adam Gorb brings up John Fowles' Three Mantras. Now actually John Fowles is one of those composers I probably would have chosen if I hadn't chosen the others, but he's another one of those composers that I discovered him actually when the CBSO did with Zachary Oromo did was it a complete John Fowles or was it just a sort of focus, Richard, on John Fowles?
Not quite. Zachary Oromo is. I one reason why I respect him is that he won't do the complete thing. He sort of looks at what's good and does what's good, and he leaves out stuff that's not so good.
Well, he did a complete Stravinsky, to be fair, which was absolutely fascinating. But
he didn't do all of it. But the the BBC asked him, I think, to do the World Requiem, this big Fowles choral work, and Zachary looked at it and just didn't really think it was Fowles at his best, and he didn't really feel he wanted to do it, and he didn't do it. Everyone was very surprised.
But the Three Mantras, I think, fabulous piece. So much Eastern influence in almost all of John Fowles' music. I mean, he's very much part of what he is. But
it's sort of the planets collides with the poem of ecstasy, isn't
it?
With a chorus, and wow, wham, the vortex of energy in that music. I mean, that is absolutely a piece which, if people heard it more, would be that would be a popular classic. That would be a classic FM Hall of Fame. That would be the conductors queuing up to do it so they can get that big storm of applause at the end. If only.
Well, one of the other pieces I wanted to mention, I have mentioned it before, definitely, is the Panufnik Piano Concerto, which I think is a terrific piece. Again, another composer, Panufnik, who perhaps isn't in the concert hall quite enough as he should be. But the other piece I wanted to mention that was in that concert I was talking about, the prom that I went to when I was young, that had the Hindemith camera music, completely different piece, was the Second Symphony of Oliver Knussen. Written in, I think, 1970, 71. So he wasn't even 20 by this point. I mean, obviously, he'd had his first symphony famously played through by the LSO when he was 15, I think he was. His father was the principal bass. Stuart was principal bass of the LSO at the time, so that was a great opportunity for him. But I mean, he was obviously a wunderkind, no question about it. But the Symphony Number 2 is a completely different kettle of fish, and very sophisticated writing, beautiful setting. Essentially, it's a song cycle, I suppose, really, rather than a symphony. But it's for high soprano, and high soprano is important. And I think it might also be one of the reasons why it's not performed as often, because it does need a very particular kind of soprano to get that pitch. I think Sarah Leonard has done it a few times. She's quite well known was quite well known for doing the higher repertoire in the contemporary repertoire anyway. But it's such a gorgeous piece, beautifully constructed. It's quite sort of filmic, really, in a lot of what he's doing. There was I think a bit of a controversy about the fact that, I mean, a lot of it is 12 tone, but it resolves into a rather stark tritone, which I think put quite a lot of people off at the time. I mean, you remember 1971, this is very much Boulez's time at BBC Symphony Orchestra. It was all about the difficult music, and so to do something as shocking as a lovely tritone, a lovely major chord, lovely, beautiful. Anyway, it's a great piece, Nussin, and I worry a little bit that there was so much dedication to Ollie's music when he was alive, and since his death, I worry that his music is not going to get performed as much now that he's not there to do it himself. I think I worried the same when Tippett died, that, people were so dedicated to Tippett while he was alive and really wanted to keep his music going, and a lot of it quite tough music. But when he died, I think it dropped off quite substantially. People stopped doing his music, and I wonder whether it would almost disappear. In fact, he's another composer who, I think, Mask of Time, great piece that perhaps isn't done as much as it should do. And I think that can happen also with composers, can't it? That they're celebrated in their lifetime and then they drop away. I mean, you've talked about it, Richard, you mentioned it about composers back in time. And in fact, another person, I think Stephen Pettit on Facebook, mentions, the contemporaries of Beethoven and Mozart, they weren't the only guys in town, but as you've already said. But yeah, I'd quite like to hear more of the symphonic music of Ollie Nussin. I mean, he was a bit of his own worst enemy in a lot of senses, because he didn't always finish pieces, and it was always a bit of a unknown quantity whether, if you commissioned him, that it was going to be completed or when it was going to be completed. He obviously found writing difficult, but when he got it right, I mean, his ear is extraordinary. The sounds, the sonorities, the colours in those pieces are fabulous. And so I want to hear more of Oliver Nussin's music. Symphony Number 2 really hit me at the time when I was young, so I can recommend that one. Where are we, Charlotte? Some more? Throw in a couple now as we.
Okay, well, I'm going to throw in a sublime movement that has got buried in a fairly okayish piece as a whole. Haydn's, I'm going to go all classic FM and pluck out a movement. Haydn's Violin Concerto Number 1. Now, Haydn's cello concertos, obviously wonderful, famous everywhere. Mozart's 5 violin concertos, early works, wonderful everywhere. Haydn's violin concertos, we're not even sure how many there really were. Probably 3, about 10 have been attributed to him over time. They're not as sparkling as Mozart's. They're quite early works from his early days in Esterhazy. But the first out of them, I think, deserves more airtime than it gets, but not all of it. So the first movement is probably the least interesting. It's sort of transitional between Baroque and classical periods. It's part ritornello form, early sonata form. It's a bit ploddy, to be honest. The final movement, I mean, it's merry, it's toe tapping, but nothing to write home about. But, oh my gosh, the slow movement, it is sublime. It's so songful and lyrical and aria-like. The violin comes in straight away with this rising, long-lined phrase crescendoing with the orchestra throbbing underneath. I don't want to sound too excited, but if I say it sounds like a slow building gasp of pleasure, then you can see where I'm going with that. And then it kind of moves into this delicate aria with this barely there string pizzicato accompaniment underneath, and it's just exquisite. And if you are a violinist who has poise and grace and nobility, the sort of Lisa Battishvili character, it's just achingly affecting. And the other thing, because it's sort of straddling the Baroque and classical periods, I mean, there's a lot you can do to make it your own with the ornamentation, play your own cadenza, do something interesting with that. And I think it's sacrilegious to say this perhaps, but I think this is one where it's okay just to bin the outer two movements, extract the gold. And it's a movement that works on its own in, play it before the concerto, the big concerto in a concert. Play it as the first piece before you play the symphony. I don't know. It works by itself, and I think that we should hear it more. And then going on to funny names that sound frightfully complicated and therefore must be terrifying, but in fact really aren't. Ferdinand Tiero, his octet, Opus 62. Now, this is a piece that I had never heard of, and then in 2019 I turned up at the Zermatt Festival. It's this wonderful little-known festival nestled right underneath the Matterhorn in this town where there are no cars. And the festival is almost entirely centred on the Academy, and the orchestra musicians come from the top European youth orchestras, and not so many Brits in recent years that they want to do something about. So if anybody is listening who wants to send young Brits keen on an orchestral career to a wonderful place to be tutored by the Sharoon Ensemble from the Berlin Phil from a week, that's the place to do it. But the sort of the week, other than the big name soloist, the meat other than big name soloist concerts at the weekend is these weekday chamber concerts. And I'm not sure when I've ever been hit with so much obscure repertoire all at the same time, because one of the features of this festival is that it's not just strings chamber music. They're trying to incorporate the whole orchestra. And so you have all of these pieces that's melding brass and woodwind and strings in all sorts of unusual combinations. And because the Sharoon Ensemble have pretty much played everything as Berlin Phil members, they want to stretch themselves and they're looking for something different as well. So anyway, Ferdinand Tiero's octet in B flat, published in 1893, for clarinet, bassoon, horn, 2 violins, viola, cello and double bass. I'd never heard of him, and I assumed he was French until I saw Ferdinand, and he was German. He had the same teacher as Brahms, Edward Markson, Hamburg-based. He was friends with Brahms, and Brahms championed him. Admired in his day, particularly for his chamber music, subsequently forgotten after his death. Apparently, partly because the archive with his manuscripts got shipped to Leningrad after the First World War. I don't know how accurate that is. But this octet is a substantial piece of music. It's about half an hour long. 5 movements. There's a lot of Brahms in it, in the warmth, wistful nostalgia, the use of the clarinet. It makes you think almost of Brahms's clarinet quintet, the fluidity. Like Brahms, he's classically rooted. He was clearly in the Brahms rather than the Liszt camp when it came to absolute rather than programmatic music and reaching back to sort of early classicism. But it's gorgeous stuff. I mean, really deft blending, democratic employment of the instruments, really playing to the strengths, these mellifluous rising clarinet lines, softly heroic horn calls, constant new emotional landscapes on offer, new textures. I'm not sure the world is quite ready for a Tiero revival. But this particular one, I mean, it's constantly presenting you with new ideas, new beauty. You hear it and you want to hear it again and get to know it. And I think it's a really good listener. So just as one particular piece, let's not resurrect Tiero full stop, but I think that this is a piece that if you could find the right combination of chamber musicians deserves to be heard far more. Maybe it's one for more festivals.
Terrific. And by the way, if you think it's only Classic FM that plays single movements, you haven't been listening to Radio 3 recently.
No,
a couple of other things to throw in from the contributions on Facebook. A Corn Gold from Declan McGovern, Abschiedslieder, Songs of Farewell. Gillian Moore at the South Bank has suggested Dorothy Howell, Lamia. We played a piece called Lamia in the wind band when I was small. Gary Carpenter, another composer's Kalinikov's First Symphony. And David Kent has suggested any symphony by Eduard Tubin, or in fact any work by him, in fact. And he mentions, actually, it's quite interesting, saying that his toccata was programmed at the Proms a few years back, but it was dropped when Naima Yervi had to cancel and was replaced by Dudamel. So I assume Dudamel didn't know the piece. But it might have been, David says, it might have been just the Proms exposure that it needed, or that the composer needed. And actually, sometimes it really is as simple as that, isn't it? You give a composer a big platform within a concert of other music, and suddenly people's ears have opened, and they want to go and want to explore more. So thank you, everyone, by the way, for your fascinating contributions to this. So much music to discover there. Richard, throw us a couple more.
Not sure I should still stay in Britain. We're talking about so much British music today. But I want to talk about two Welsh composers. Just want to throw in the symphonist Daniel Jones. Fascinating chap, school friend of Dylan Thomas, and actually gets mentioned in Dylan, appears in various of Dylan Thomas's writings. He's later his biographer. He was a remarkable literary scholar, also a symphonist. I think something like 12 symphonies. I haven't counted them lately, but they and again a comparable sequence of string quartets which he was writing, into advanced old age. He died in the 1980s. And it's an utterly unique, distinctive voice. He's a 20th century symphonist in the mould of people we talked about, like Robert Simpson, like Henze, like Milo. He's he's sort of composers who are perhaps overlooked because they write in a genre that's supposedly unfashionable, but who nonetheless have this sort of immense intellectual rigour to what they do. There's also this atmosphere about it, this sort of brooding. I like to think of as a sort of Welsh, Celtic kind of atmosphere to it. Certainly never anything as crass as a folk song or, sort of obvious coloristic effects, but the kind of seriousness of purpose, a kind of gravity to the music that I find really compelling. And he wrote a gorgeous, gorgeous choral work in 1958 called "The Country Beyond the Stars." I think it's words by Thomas Herbert. I may have. I'll get that wrong. But it's a gorgeous, radiant, expansive thing. The other Welsh composer I want to mention is Grace Williams, a particular piece of hers called Fantasia on Welsh Nursery Tunes. She was a great friend of Benjamin Britten, very active in the 1940s, made a career in London, then went back to Swansea, and after that was never really taken seriously again, despite writing some extraordinary works, including a really fine one-act opera and 2 symphonies. And this is probably her best-known work, the Fantasia on Welsh Nursery Tunes. It's this interesting thing. It's sort of regarded as an oddity, as a scarcity. And the truth is, I played it in 3 different youth orchestras when I was growing up. I've played it since then in at least 2 amateur orchestras. I played amateur orchestras in North Wales. I grew up near the Welsh borders. That may have something to do with that. And it's interesting that even regions within countries have quite different musical cultures. Daniel Jones, again, I encountered while I was playing in the Wrexham Symphony Orchestra in North Wales. He was known to musicians there, to the amateur musicians there, as a significant figure. And this Grace Williams piece comes up a lot. It's an absolute delight. It is a sort of medley of, as it says, Welsh nursery tunes, but with this glorious kind of scoring that was unique to her. She has a sound that is quite distinctive. It's fresh, it's clear, it's bracing, it's vivid colours, primary colours. At the same time, a rawness. I say it's sort of somewhere between Hindemith, Neo, and Vaughan Williams, if you can imagine such a thing. Try to describe it. It's just very herself, very Welsh, very British, very Grace Williams. She has, again, she's a voice. The more I listen to it, the more compelling and the more enjoyable I find it. I've known this music since I was a child. To me, I was surprised that she was regarded as obscure, but it's interesting. Again, the sort of regional attitudes and national attitudes towards composers shape how they're perceived. There's an incredible story in John Drummond's memoirs. He was controlling the proms, of course, for many years. It just reveals it all. He's just absolutely baffled why people in Wales would want to listen to the BBC Welsh Symphony Orchestra playing Beethoven in Cardiff. Why would they want to hear a Welsh orchestra playing Cardiff? Playing Beethoven. We all know they're second rate. Is the implication? Says the guy who runs this orchestra and funds it. Interestingly, he makes a pitiful joke about Welsh music is Matthias in the north and Mount Hoddinot in the south, and they've both been climbed. And, it's that mentality is fascinating. Sort of, if something vanishes to the regions, it's not taken very seriously. And that certainly happened with Grace Williams' career in music. So yes, unfairly neglected. Extremely fine music, extremely enjoyable music. And that would be the last of my British choices for today, anyway.
Well, and I guess we ought to say, if we are talking about neglect, female composers are right up there. And I think if we can say anything in the last few years, it's certainly been the case that far more of them are getting more performances now. And that's not just, it's an incredibly healthy time, I think, for female contemporary composers, but particularly younger ones. But I think also some of the names that we've mentioned already today have started to sort of come back into the repertoire. Obviously, it's been slightly different than last year, but I'm sure that's going to continue. And it does certainly seem that the administrators that we've been mentioning are more keen on on trying to redress the balance a little bit now, anyway, which is good news. Sorry, Richard.
Well, we keep saying this. I've got to bring it up at some point, talking about the administrators, these terrible people in suits who are spoiling the free-spirited music, spoiling the whole thing, by putting, not letting these wonderful, brave musicians heroically champion these neglected composers. I mean, I can think of plenty of administrators who've spent years trying to persuade conductors to play some piece which isn't already in their repertoire, where conductors will not touch.
No,
because it doesn't end with enough of a cheer. It won't get them gigs in Germany or whatever. It's not in standard. They don't want to learn a piece they're going to play once and won't get played again, as far as they're concerned. They don't believe in. And I've come, there's a great deal of that as well. I mean, I know a lot of administrators who are passionate champions for neglected repertoire, who really try and get these things going and do struggle against this sort of massive weight of conservatism of what did Mahler say? Tradition is laziness. Try and book a cellist to play anything except the sort of corrupt, inaccurate official version of the Rococo Variations by Tchaikovsky. That's what they all learned. It's what their teachers taught them. They're not going to bother learning a different version, which they won't get asked to play anywhere else. I think in Birmingham, I think we went through a phase of about 10 years of trying to find a conductor willing to conduct Rachmaninoff's Third Symphony. Seems to have come back in fashion now. Probably wouldn't have a problem, but for a long time, they didn't think they'd get any gigs with it. They probably didn't think they'd get much audience with it. They weren't going to put in the miles to make it happen.
I want to make it absolutely clear that I wasn't talking about administrators in that way. I was merely mentioning that they exist and they're incredibly important in this entire process and in the ecosystem of music. They're the ones that often it comes down to with the programming. But you're absolutely right. Of course, they also come up against conservative musicians and conductors everywhere they go. So I'm just going to throw in a couple. I mentioned that I was going to choose another composer like Korngold, who is unfairly ignored because of his association with film music. And I've mentioned him before, but I think he's definitely worth mentioning again. And that's Christopher Gunning, who is very much alive and still writing symphonies. He is best known for writing music for television and film. Poirot is his most famous theme, I think. It's repeated endlessly on televisions all over the world. He wrote the music for La Vie en Rose, the movie, and also legendarily in the 70s wrote the music for the Martini ads that we were all singing. He's a brilliant composer, but he's really not doing that kind of composition anymore. He's concentrating on his, again, in inverted commas, serious music. He writes symphonies and other works, but he's all of them are pretty much now, I think, have been recorded. And Signum put out a disc a couple of years ago of 3 of his symphonies, one of which is the 10th, which is a single movement symphony, which I absolutely love. His writing, it's so sophisticated, and I suppose you could fairly say that it because it's so beautifully orchestrated. I mean, you can tell that he is a very fine film composer from the way in which he scores. But I don't want that to take anything away from the seriousness of the approach also. I think he's a fine symphonist, and the single movement one I think works really, really well. He's very good at narrative. Narrative is everything for him. I mean, you can see why, for example, he gravitated towards music for film, because narrative is everything to him. But what I like about it, particularly in the case of the Symphony Number 10, is that he doesn't want you to know what that narrative is. He wants you to come up with your own narrative. And if you do feel something in the music that connects you to a story that is particularly personal, then that in a way is his job done. I like that. I like that he doesn't sort of spell it out and say what this bit of music means, what that bit of music means. It's not programmatic in that sense, but it does, I suppose, it has a narrative there, but he's just not going to tell you what it is. I like that. Beautifully scored, great colours, wonderful sweeps of melody. He isn't writing in a style that you might say is modern, whatever that might mean, but it's approachable, but it's sophisticated and it's beautifully handled. And I think his music needs to be programmed. You just feel that one of the reasons it isn't is because he's not given a fair crack of the whip, because people see that he's the guy that wrote the theme for Poirot. So how can he possibly write a serious symphony? And it's such a shame that even in 2021, we're still thinking that people actually do think like that. And they really do. And those that are in power still think like that. I'm hoping, actually, I think Signum Records have been brilliant, and it's a beautiful recording. It's well done by the BBC National Orchestra of Wales, conducted by Kenneth Woods. It's really well performed. And I know it has been broadcast as well on Radio 3, which is great. So it has had some exposure. But I want these pieces to be put in the repertoire. I think they'd be great for amateur orchestras as well, and youth orchestras. So anyone listening who has that power, please do give those a consideration. They're terrific pieces. And the last thing I want to say is connected actually to last week's podcast, which was an interview I recorded in 2018 with Terry Edwards, the choral director, who also was very much the driving force behind Electric Phoenix, who are an extended vocal technique quartet of singers. They, in the 80s and beyond, commissioned dozens and dozens of composers to write for them, and very much in that extended vocal technique genre. So they're quite challenging and very, very difficult pieces to perform, and were often written specifically for those voices. So it does make it maybe difficult to translate over to other voices. But one of the points that Terry made in the interview was that all of those pieces, and some of them are really fine works by some terrific composers, they haven't been picked up by anyone else. Because they're mostly retired now, those guys that are singing in that group. And there's a couple of groups, he said, that have picked up some of their works, but not many. And I find that quite interesting. Maybe that music has now gone out of fashion, and we need to wait for it to come back into fashion again. But pieces like another piece I've mentioned before on this program, Darrell Runswick's I Sing the Body Electric, which is settings of Walt Whitman, among others. Phenomenal piece of music to listen to. It's available on Darrell's website to listen to as a recording by Electric Phoenix. Nigel Osborne's Choralis 1, 2 and 3. Really interesting, dangerous sounding music, with the voice being, the demands on the voice are extraordinary, the different sounds that a voice can make. And Trevor Wishart, there's a name that was popped up all the time in this sort of era in the 80s and 90s. His Vox, and again, fascinating music written for voice, but they're not being done. So Berio's Symphonia, that's been mentioned before, that's done. That's a piece that's done. Although I think there was a big fashion for that piece to be done, and it's not maybe done as much now. Electric Phoenix have done that hundreds of times, that piece of music, and that's got a lot of extended vocal technique in it. But not these pieces that are specifically just for voice, really contemporary works. And it'd be lovely to think that there's some vocal groups out there, some young vocal groups, that are interested in the edges of the repertoire, the more challenging parts of that repertoire, that maybe they can pick them up and champion them again. That would be really lovely. Right, we should wrap up and just check that we haven't missed anything that you desperately want to tell us about, Charlotte and Richard. Charlotte?
Yes.
Very briefly.
Well, very briefly, Paganini's Violin Concerto No. 1 is neglected by established violinists. It's a young prodigy piece, and then it gets dropped. And if you are, and people tend to forget that Paganini wasn't just about all these extraordinary techniques and flash. The reason why he impressed people like Schubert and Liszt was because he was also a poet. And ultimately, if you play these pieces well and the technique is so under your fingers that you can just toss it off and concentrate on telling the story, then these are wonderful works, and you don't often hear that. So Paganini Violin Concerto No. 1, played by a real pro. And then also Paganini sonatas for violin and guitar. And I think the reason why you don't hear these is simply because it's quite hard to get a really great violinist and guitarist together. But these are dear little things. They're elegant, they're eloquent, they're gentle, they're a completely different kettle of fish to the violin concertos. Wonderful stuff. And along the same sort of violin virtuoso lines, Wieniawski's Violin Concerto No. 1, Vieuxtemps No. 5. Again, if you can play them as music, not as a technical feat. Chanson Poème in the violin and piano version, not the orchestral version. Absolutely beautiful. I would love to hear that more in chamber concerts. Nielsen Violin Concerto, Beethoven Choral Fantasy, Dvorak Piano Concerto, all works that I've mentioned before, but I adore them.
Right, lots and lots of choices there. Richard, any more? Just a couple from you? Then we...
Entire genre of Central European operetta, at least in this country. We know precisely two works from this repertoire. We know Die Fledermaus and we know The Merry Widow. That is it. I would like
Yes.
to hear a lot more of Emmerich Kalaman's operettas, Autumn Manoeuvres, Countess Maritza, The Duchess of Chicago. I'd like to hear Paul Abraham's jazz operettas, which have been a massive smash in Berlin lately. Very cool new productions. Things like Victoria and her Hussar or Ball and Savoy. I would like to hear... obviously, a lot more Lehar. I'd like to hear Victor Herbert, the American operetta composer of the turn of the century. I'd love to hear his operetta Naughty Marietta done in England. Not least because it has an English libretto. The one piece I was going to single out, and there's so much Lehar that we did not know in this country. People think The Merry Widow is a whole story. He became a very different kind of composer after the First World War. He writes these things far closer in many ways to Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals, dealing with quite contemporary concerns and really stretching himself musically and emotionally with the plots and the storylines and the way he wrote. The one I was going to pick up is probably his least well-known later operetta. It's called Schön ist die Welt. Fair is the world is beautiful. And it's a story, it's a standard operetta story. You've got a prince, a handsome prince in disguise. You've got a beautiful princess also in disguise. They don't know that they're royalty. They just know they're going to be married off soon to this... well, it turns out to each other. I'm not giving too much away. They don't realise this. They're trying to flee these arranged marriages. They meet each other by accident. He's pretending to be a mountain guide. She's on holiday in the Alps. And basically, the central act of this operetta, all the other stuff. You've got the waltzes, you've got the witty duets, you've got the little jazzy numbers. But of the entire central act, Lehar does something completely different. He's obviously been listening to Richard Strauss's Alpine Symphony. The whole act is set to one sweep of full, rich orchestral music. And it's depicting basically this couple climbing this mountain in the Alps. And as they climb the mountain, gradually falling in love, culminating this rapturous love scene. And then this kind of sunset descent from the mountain. And it's all in one. The whole act begins... great surge of sound. It's a 30-minute sweep of the most lush late romantic music. You'd think it was Richard Strauss if you heard it, or any of those sort of late romantic, or even Puccini conceivably, not Lehar. And it's a piece I love very, very much indeed. So much so that I kind of I was inspired by it to choose my honeymoon destination with my wife when we got married. I thought I would whisk her off to an old Belle Epoque hotel high in the Alps and see what happens. And that music was kind of rushing through my mind the whole time I was there. It's a fascinating and wonderful piece. But to finish, every opera by Rimsky-Korsakov, any opera by Christoph Willibald von Gluck, probably I think the most important 18th century composer we never listen to anymore, and any Dvorak symphony before number 7.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you very much. I want to very quickly mention a composer I'd never come across before. He's a composer and guitarist, but one of his psalm settings was performed in the funeral of Prince Philip last week. William Lovelady. I thought it was an absolutely gorgeous setting, and so I'm off to find out a little bit more about him. Although it was wonderful on YouTube. Someone had put the video up of it and said how lovely it was, but I hadn't said who it was by. And William Lovelady himself said, "Please credit the composer." And I think it rather surprised the person that put it up, because I'm not sure they even imagined that he was alive. And there he is suddenly talking to him. The wonders of social media. But I thought it was gorgeous and beautifully performed, of course. And so I'm going to find out a little bit more about him. A nice surprise from that event. Thank you very much. We'd like, of course, to know your choices. What are the pieces that you think should be in the concert hall far more than they are already? Let us know in the usual way. But for now, thank you very much. As always, Richard Bratby, Charlotte Gardner. We'll see you next week. If you enjoyed the Classical Top 5, please do consider making a donation. Details are always in the summaries of each of our podcasts. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, we're at Classical Top 5. On Facebook, we have a page, The Classical Top 5. Just search for that. And if you'd like to email us, because we always like to hear from you, please do. classicaltop5@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.